Welcome to Natural Recovery from Suffering. This is Scott Killaby. I'm going to make the case against awareness, not against awareness itself or non-dual awareness, which would be weird, but about how focusing on that, especially exclusively on a spiritual path, becomes a distraction from how we create suffering. But we wouldn't know it because we create our own suffering because it keeps us safe and gets us love. Survival as a separate self. And it's always been that way. That conditioning of survival, stay safe, get love, including in relationship, that survival programming has been behind the sense of separation since the dawn of time. We carry it in our bodies. This is our trauma, which will be revealed as you do deep work. What I mean is, but we're being driven by survival programming. And when it comes to emotional stuff, it's as simple as I'm afraid to get hurt, rejected, to lose people. There's a fear, a frozen fear that we carry around from usually what happened to us earlier in life. And then we hold back emotions. As we hold back what's true, we're forced to identify with what's false. All of that to protect ourselves as a separate self in relationship and otherwise. And so it's conditioning buried in the body that does this. That's the first thing I want to say. Now, to start making the case against awareness, I wanted you to have that context that we're driven by this conditioning. It's buried. I want you to imagine thousands of years ago, before there was anything like spiritual awakening or enlightenment or teachings or non-duality. Some guy's in his house, his little hut with his wife, and she's nagging him to do some chores or something. And he gets triggered, but he doesn't get angry. Doesn't express anything in terms of emotions to her. With his trigger, he just disconnects and leaves the house. Walks through town and he finds somebody who teaches him how to meditate. So you sit down there and just watch your thoughts, your feelings, just let it all be. Notice that you are the awareness to which it all comes and goes. So he sits down and just watches, just thoughts that you and I would have. It's even though it's thousands of years ago, it's the same consciousness. So it'd be like, I'm not good enough. There's something wrong with me. She's this. If she would do that. All that usual stuff, he just sits and watches it. Now, you can't see anything in the story maybe which would alarm you. And that's how bypassing happens. It happens in a way that you don't see it. So he's sitting there watching, feeling these things come and go. Let's say all this stuff comes and goes, and he watches long enough, and it not only gets quieter, but he just notices presence. And as he notices the presence, that sort of reinforces his wanting to just sit and watch things instead of identifying and all that. So he keeps going with that. And that becomes his way of being in life. He just sees that he's the awareness. Now, he has no idea that there's buried anger there, and has no idea that buried anger and or hurt has been there since childhood, and that's that fear, the holding back what's true, forced to identify with what's false. So he doesn't know about the repression because it's buried. When he's sitting and watching everything, the buried emotion would just be a sensation, like this sense of separation. But he might just call it or feel it as a sensation in the stomach or in the heart or a pain or something. But that would be coming and going seemingly to the awareness. So he wouldn't pay much attention to that. Any persistent sensation, it doesn't change the fact that there's still awareness presence here for him. See, we'll call him Joseph. Joseph had a vested interest in not feeling and expressing anger since he was a kid, but from the time his wife triggered him until the time he walked and met the wise man and started to meditate, Joseph was carrying conditioning that said, under no circumstances will I feel and express anger. And that's real conditioning in Joseph's body. So when he's with his wife and she's nagging, he's not aware that he has buried anger. And he's not aware, for example, that disconnection, that fleeing her or leaving is just safer than staying there and feeling and expressing the anger. He doesn't know that being even drawn to the wise man is being driven by the repression because he's not aware of it. He's just suffering. And the wise man probably looks peaceful, which is, appealing to Joseph with buried anger. And the wise man is pointing to something that is appealing to Joseph because nothing in that suggests anger. And Joseph doesn't experience anger much. And so everything is safe about the practice that the wise man suggests. The suggestion itself is safe for Joseph's nervous system to a certain degree. Joseph may still have fear coming up, but his greatest fear is buried. And he's safe from that in all of this. And as he sits down to meditate, he's still safe because the buried anger won't arise. But what will arise are the triggers and the identities and shadows, all of which are safer than the buried anger and produced by it. But he wouldn't know that. He would just be sitting as awareness, noticing the stuff like, I'm not good enough. Not knowing that, when he was a kid, he had to develop a false identity because he couldn't feel and express what was true. Hear the anger. So having buried the anger, he just sees and feels the false identities coming and going in awareness. And then lulls himself into a false confidence in terms of his real clarity or freedom because he doesn't see the root of any of these things. And the root just stays there in his body as a sensation. But that sensation, as he recognizes presence, doesn't seem like a big deal. Perhaps. And so he doesn't dig into it or anything. And the wise man didn't tell him to do that. The wise man looked peaceful. And so Joseph doesn't dig into that. But he has some realization or shift that's transformative, like life-changing. Well, let's say, instead of going back to his wife, and by the way, this is not the story of Buddha. I just think this is probably a lot of people throughout history. But let's say he doesn't go back to his wife or his kids, or he goes back, but he can never really be the father in the same way. Let's just say he doesn't go back, and instead he becomes a wise man, a teacher, and other people who are leaving or escaping their houses and their families and their relationships come to him. He says, I can help you. Sit down and just watch everything come and go. That's what I did. And freedom came. But see, we don't know what's going on with Joseph, right? So Joseph gets a little bit older. He keeps helping people. He might die of cancer or he might have chronic pain from the buried anger. But would Joe connect those two things? He's got that anger buried. So he wouldn't even know about the diseases coming or anything that's coming because it's coming from buried anger. And it's buried. And as people come to him, he's just saying, look, he doesn't experience the buried stuff. He might experience the sensation. And if they come to him and say, well, I've sat down and watched it all, but I've got this sensation here. He might say, well, just let that be. You don't have to do anything with that. Because that's what he was taught, and it worked to make an end run around that buried anger, see? And everybody's fooled in that chain of events because the buried anger doesn't feel like anger. So it's easy to pass on the pointer to each person. That's just a sensation coming and going in presence. Nobody calls it anger or hurt because it's frozen emotion from childhood. Joseph might be one of those teachers who talks about separation, but he might say, if there's a sense of separation in the body, just notice that that's a sensation. You're aware of it. So that's not you. Like, he can just build his teaching out of that. And let's say just throughout history, Joseph, his teaching becomes one of the great traditions. Started with Joseph. Let's say this is an alternate reality. Even though it's like the story of Buddha, I don't want to touch the story of Buddha because I don't know his realization. And it could have been that he had a really deeply embodied realization. And I don't know enough about his personal life to tell that story. But definitely just random Josephs throughout history who had a vested interest in staying safe from buried stuff, got some freedom, and then passed it on to others. So if you look at history then, if people did that, maybe a lot of disconnecting from their families and life and people, and then coming into a spiritual practice, which is divorced from their life, having an awakening experience that doesn't get to the buried stuff, but the buried stuff was creating the suffering in their life. See that? So it's a complete bypass. It's like the buried emotions are creating the suffering with my wife. I'm Joseph. I can't feel and express that buried anger to her, so I leave. The buried emotions are driving me to leave, to disconnect. It's safer. The buried emotions are driving me into a practice of seeing everything that comes up from the buried emotions, but don't deal with the buried emotions. And then don't go back to the wife or back to life, because that's not safe. Create a teaching and help others instead. And in fact, not only help them wake up, but help them avoid their buried stuff by just saying that's a sensation. Don't dig. And so a tradition is born. Let's say tradition, we'll call it whatever. Acme spiritual tradition. And throughout history then, other people who needed to escape their wife either because of buried anger, hurt, sadness, some unprocessed thing from childhood that couldn't be expressed or felt, needs that couldn't be met coming from that in relationship, drove people to that tradition. And that tradition then had Joseph's teaching in it, which had the bypass, passed on generation to generation of teachers to students. Well, that's basically what happened throughout history in different traditions. But this is where people go, hold on, not in my traditions. There were traditions throughout history, I'm not an expert on traditional Advaita, but there are exceptions to this. But all you have to do is, do you feel a sense of separation still? Contraction in your body, no matter how much work you've done. That's where it all kind of boils down to that in the end. And that's where the trauma is held. That's where the producer of suffering is in the body. If you still have contraction and that sense of separation, it could be that your tradition or practice doesn't focus on that or doesn't focus on the transmuting of that. So then therefore it's part of the bypass, because that's where the emotional repression and trauma is held. So if you still have that, it could be that your practice has protected you, like Joseph's, from ever getting to that. Or some practices have gotten really sophisticated in terms of looking like they get to repression, but repression is very specific. I'm angry, but I can't express it. I'm hurt. I'm afraid. I can't express it. It's something very simple at the core of our being. And so anything above that, of course, is safer than that buried stuff. If we just mull around in what's safer or rest with what's safer, we never get to those buried emotions. And those are mind-body connections buried in the body. So it's, of course, you want to take a look at your practice or your path to see if the focus is on something other than what's producing your suffering. But here's the thing. If you have buried emotions, you probably don't even think that the buried emotions are creating your suffering. Because that's the one thing about repression, is that the emotions are repressed, and so we're unconscious to the root of it. We just experience the suffering. And when it comes into as depression, Unless we had science, how would we know? It comes from repression, unless we were in the body and skillful enough to see it. Or it comes up as anxiety. But how would we know without the science and without skill that this anxiety is there because we're afraid to feel and express what's true to our loved ones? It's just safer to have anxiety than it is to show hurt, for example, to some people. It's the buried emotions creating our suffering, just like science says. But where in our spiritual traditions, including Joseph's, is that fact dealt with front and center? And that's really the bypass. But if you can understand that we all have a vested interest in just not dealing with this issue, you can understand it better. You can understand how traditions were created and maintained in that bypass as like a shelter for our trauma. Many, many anger and hurt and sadness repressors have come through and sought and found shelter from their buried emotions, many of whom got sick later. So, Ken Wilber, you should look up his research into people exposed to Eastern practices, monks and otherwise, who missed the emotional repression and shadows and suffered with diseases, pain, continued emotional suffering, because their meditation or awareness practice didn't get to it. This is very much a real thing that we're just beginning to discover. We have the science now that says emotional repression drives a lot of our suffering. We've got Ken who led the way with that research. There are other people. There's KI now where you can get straight to repression. It's so important to see it now because we have everything. And let me try to make this case against awareness from a different angle now. If you're not conscious of this, if you can understand that the repression is driving things, so whenever you have to hold back what's true, you're forced to identify with what's false. It just isn't safe to feel and express what's true, whatever that may be. And that's usually just one or more emotions that feel really unsafe, but they're not really. They're the key to our freedom, but our conditioning tells us that they're really unsafe and then just keeps them buried. The conditioning that buries them, then that produces the false identification. See? It produces it. So, because we're holding back what's true. Therefore, when we pick up an awareness practice, it's being driven by the repression, just like everything else. And that's Joseph. That's the tradition that Joseph created, that the repression was driving him away from his wife to the wise man, to the meditation practice, and then to teaching it to others. Much of which was to stay safe from what was buried. Joseph's intentions were good, but sabotage is sabotage. Emotional repression creates the sabotage. So many of us, even if we heard this, we would still have the intention to not do it at the conscious level. I had as a teacher, when I would hear stories, I would never hear a story like this, but when I'd hear bypassing stories, I would say, well, I don't want to do that. And most earnest people would say that, but you don't understand that repression drives everything. So repression drives that. It says, oh, I don't want to do that, and then you just go about doing it. Repression continuing to drive everything. Because although your conscious mind says that, it's the unconscious that drives everything. So saying I don't want to do that is like a blip on a screen full of avoidance coming from repression. When I say we're bamboozling ourselves, I mean it. I can't imagine that Carl Sagan meant anything other than repression when he said, if people have bamboozled themselves long enough, meaning really before they were born, it's intergenerational. But if we've bamboozled ourselves long enough throughout history and throughout our own life, then when somebody presents evidence that we're creating it, the suffering, and that we're bamboozling ourselves, people will deny it. because we have to stay safe and get love and survive. See, we're just doing, our conditioning is being successful when we're sabotaging, suffering, seeking, and not ending the suffering. That's conditioning that is successful. And so once you see that when we're suffering, it's staying safe and getting love, surviving, conditioning is successful, then why would you want to just pick up an awareness practice and watch your conditioning be successful? You just sit and watch it be successful all day long and just let it all be. And it sounds really loving, but it's violent because it's avoidant of the thing that creates it all. And so there's resistance to the thing that creates it all that's buried. Severe resistance to buried anger or hurt. And then things come into awareness and we say, well, just allowing it all lovingly. But we have a violence at the unconscious level, and then at the conscious level we tell ourselves, many of us anger repressors, lulling ourselves and each other into this bypass. Just notice that. Be gentle, loving, welcoming. But then when you go to the unconscious level, the person is just raging at dad and hates themselves. And that's what's driving everything that's coming up. It's sad to sit and watch some of these spiritual practices where people, I see so many anger repressors, for example, who are always insisting on, we need to talk about the love in practice to really welcome stuff. And I'm just like, you're pissed. You're fucking pissed. You're violently opposed to yourself at the unconscious level. That's why you're suffering. So to love and allow what arises is a bamboozle, because you're already severely resisting a core emotion, and therefore just trying to annihilate yourself with practice. Because if you would allow that buried emotion, you wouldn't try to get rid of anything. Everything would then be allowed, and realization would be natural. Making this case, I have to apologize again, because I see other teachers doing it now who are they're becoming quote unquote more vulnerable, and they're anger repressors. And it's just a bamboozle. I did it from 2010 to 2014 with I'm unlovable and the hurt and woundedness of that and opening to that as a teacher. It's all fucking bullshit when an anger repressor does that. It's still manipulation. And I apologize that I did it. Other teachers are doing it to you right now. I just saw one a month ago. Doing the same thing throughout history that people have done with spirituality is get love and approval by appealing to people who are also in repression and saying, I'm this, I'm more of this, or I'm more of that. But until you get to the buried stuff, you can only be a trauma response. It doesn't matter whether we dress it up as a teacher, we're still just trauma responses, trying to stay safe and get love in the world. Until we go to what's really scary, we're pretending. And then I've seen people pretend to go to what's scary and then use that to get love and approval. Like I just heard a teacher say, well, there's no reason to sort of slowly thaw out the trauma in our bodies. I had a sudden shift and I just let go of the inner child. And I'm thinking, dude, no, you're doing that right now to get people's love and approval. You're an anger repressor. It doesn't work. After a while, people get tired of hearing about the magical experiences in which all of their fucking suffering is going to go away. It's not happening for them. And it's rare in any generation, as Adyashanti says, for anyone to just release their karmic load because they've had some shift or experience. And then to teach that, dude, you're trying to get love and approval. You just can't see it. I get it. I get it. You don't see it. Until you can show all the colors of yourself to your followers, you're pretending. And that's why you want a quick fix. You want to turn to people and say, I've got this really quick, just come and sit with me. Let me show you the magic. But there's nothing magical about having to feel and express what we've never wanted to feel and express. You don't have to dress it up as a wham bam thank you, ma'am, and let's just get over our suffering in one fell swoop and hold hands and sing Kumbaya. It's not happening. That's the truth of it. It's just not happening. I sat with people, as I said, about 14,000 one-on-one sessions through the years, which I happen to think are maybe more sessions than other teachers. And I feel embarrassed by some of the things that they say about real people's lives and how they dress it up as all you have to do is recognize your true nature and then see it all coming and going, like Joseph. And then people are experiencing, if they recognize the presence, first of all, if they have that recognition. Some people never do because of their unprocessed stuff. But if they do, there's almost nobody pointing people to how we use that to get love and approval. I mean, of course we teachers do it, but I mean, many people do it. It's a way to disconnect from people, from authentic relationship. It's just to claim awakeness on some level, because it isn't real. This awareness is in all of us. It's true. We're all that, but to claim it for oneself and then to avoid buried emotions and then to disconnect from people and to claim freedom, that's just self-protection. It doesn't matter how I dress it up in spiritual words, it's still just self-protection. Until I can sit and be with the person that I love, here, Chester, and be with all the emotions that I have and all the emotions that he has, then I can't be here now. There's no be here now if I can't be here now with the person that I love and the people that are close to me and even others. If we're going to disconnect from people and relationship, I don't even want to get in the business of saying that that's liberation anymore. I don't even want to enter the conversation. If you want to have a path like that, you can. But once you learn about trauma and disconnection and repression and how so many people come to spirituality already disconnected from people and groups or who like to be alone because they're anger or other repressors who can't feel and express what's true to people, I don't want to create a teaching or a method that in any way strengthens that trauma. This is relational work. KI is. This is going to bring you back to what you're running from and see the true emptiness of it. But goddamn, stop bamboozling each other and ourselves. That's what we're going to do here. That word for me means we're going to stop focusing only on awareness. And we're going to see awareness is just the context in which it all happens. And practices to recognize that are critically important, but not as a way to resolve all your suffering, because it's actually a way to hide from it and how we create it. How we create it, this is part of the making the case against awareness, is understanding how we create suffering. So with buried emotions, we unconsciously, that conditioning that buries the emotions produces identity and other things that are simply safer than feeling and expressing what's true, which is what we've buried. It's as simple as I'm unlovable to the nervous system is safer than, for a hurt repressor, feeling and expressing the hurt to people. I'm not good enough is simply safer than. It's just a nervous system trauma thing. It's safer than feeling and expressing the buried anger if you're an anger repressor. Shame, as debilitating as it can be, it keeps us safe from feeling and expressing what's true to our loved ones. An anger repressor will hide. An anger repressor has to be good. Duality comes from repression. So if I hold back anger, I have to be good. The bad parts of me, the buried anger, and other things that I might have to hide, like sexuality, addictions, body image stuff, Those are all the parts of me that would be buried as an anger repressor, the bad parts. And so anger repressors will spend their whole life trying to be good and trying to hide the bad parts, hide the anger, hide the addiction. It's sad if you see it, that it's just a childhood development thing is all it is, and we've couched it as some sort of spiritual thing, but it just doesn't feel safe for us to be ourselves. And so we have to be good for mom and dad, hold anger back. And then all this stuff never gets talked about in spirituality. All the people who are addicted, all the shame, all the anger repressors who don't want to talk about it, obviously, because it goes along with the buried anger. It's all those parts that are bad. And if you notice, like anger repressors will get triggered when people see those parts, but they'll never get angry. And so the shame is protecting anger repressors from the buried anger. What anger repressor, if you find them out, if they have an addiction, is going to get angry at you? They don't feel like they have a right. And so shame is safer. And hurt and sadness repressors are no different. If you find out a hurt repressor, if you find them doing something and they feel shame, are they going to be vulnerable with you? No, they can't. Shame and anger, maybe. And some people can't express anything. They just feel completely disconnected, as if they have access to none of their emotions, except for maybe anxiety or something from time to time. So the case against awareness includes how we're creating our suffering, and then resting as awareness and noticing our suffering coming and going as if we're not creating it. And that keeps us safe from what's buried. So everything that's coming and going is merely safer than, and gets us love and approval from others, but it's safer than what we've buried. This is a simple understanding that once you have it, you can end suffering. If you ignore it, you don't have to do KI, but why would you ignore how your system creates suffering? Unless you just want to create suffering and stay safe and get love. Which you do. See? Everybody does. So think about that. Here's the case against awareness. Everybody has a vested interest, has conditioning, and wants to stay safe and get love above all else. So at the conscious level, we'll say, I want to be free, I am free, I'm seeking, or I've found, or something. But at the unconscious level, it's still, as long as there's repression and unprocessed, is I have to stay safe and get love no matter what. So I'll use my current realization or shift or whatever for like a spiritual resume. I'll just say, okay, now I'm here or whatever, or I'm not here. But all that activity at the conscious level of renaming and couching our experience as spiritual, or we're here or not there, or we're seeking or finding, all of it coming from repression. Because when you get to the repression level, the seeking and finding is, the fixation with it is gone. It's all to stay safe and get love. I don't see myself as someone who's realized. This feels very natural. So I'm going to leave you with this. The same thing I always say. How natural it is to recognize what you are. It's only natural if you get to the buried stuff in the beginning, because then you're seeing how you create it all. And you see you create it all for safety and to get love, and it all just makes sense. And then your only job is just to make that conditioning conscious. It's repression work. Just make conscious the conditioning that says, I don't want to be free. I just want to suffer. I want to stay. I want to get your approval. And I don't want to tell you. I want to sit here and get your approval, but not tell you. And then when I don't get your approval, I want to be triggered and suffer and process that trigger, but not get to the fact that I'm creating my suffering here. It takes more than just rest as awareness, because rest as awareness just hides the mechanism from us. We don't even see what we're doing. One thing I say to anger repressors is this. If you could see that in your relationship, or anybody who represses emotion, that you have needs and wants, but you don't maybe even know what they are, but you don't express them. And then if someone doesn't meet them, you're triggered and you suffer, and maybe you disconnect or whatever. Or maybe you're someone with a more anxious attachment and you express your needs, but then you still expect that person to meet those. That's still emotional repression, because if you could feel and express everything that was true for you, you wouldn't put your needs on other people like that. You wouldn't have those unmet needs in that way. You would know yourself. That fundamental need would be met. So this is the scenario that I want to talk about. If we lived on a conscious planet, just fast forward, if we survive thousands, if not whatever, many years, and when children are born, the focus is on development, conscious development. And so every child recognizes the awareness. I know it's so far from our reality. So you can even imagine it's another planet with other beings if you need to. Imagine that every being is born, and it's fundamentally important that the parents recognize, the parents know what they are. They've recognized the basic awareness at the foundation of all experience. So the kid recognizes it early and then is taught to feel and allow everything and not bury emotions and be identified with false things. Well, that's an entire process. That's not just, the parents wouldn't just say, okay, now your awareness. I mean, they would in that scenario, because just think of it this way. There's no trauma. So when the child is born, just imagine for a second, there's no trauma. The child just has to allow it all. That's easy enough. But that's not us. We're not children, and we're not children on that kind of a planet. So we're adults who come to a healing or awakening path, and we have buried emotions. So when a teacher, aka parent, starts to point to the awareness, the basic, the basic nature of what we are, that in and of itself can't do it, because we have buried emotions. If we were born in this theoretical world in which we didn't have trauma and buried emotions, we could just recognize the presence, and then everything would just be allowed from there. But we start with buried emotions, and as we recognize awareness, we're not ever allowing the buried emotions from the beginning of that recognition or practice. See that? And so then the buried emotions never arise, but they produce the suffering. So our allowing is always of what's safer than the buried emotions. Very different than the child on a conscious planet who's developing consciously through fully allowing everything, doesn't have buried emotions. We do, so we're never allowing everything from the beginning. And that's the bypass. We can't allow what's buried until we have the skill. So we keep allowing things and keep allowing things, and we think we're just recognizing, just like that child, what we really are and living and embodying that. But if you live for very long, you notice that you're still suffering, that you're not really living and embodying what you are. And you may have even settled for something that you think is freedom or peace, but how would you know anything? Because your conditioning just says, okay. But Thomas Hübl says that our frozen emotion, trauma, repression, is our unrealized potential. We are so selling ourselves short by not focusing on our unrealized potential from the beginning. That to me is enough reason to make the case against awareness. So to finalize this, I don't mean the case against awareness practice or pointing. I mean about focusing exclusively on that. What I've been encouraging people to do is this. To me, this is a much more mature practice, and it doesn't bypass. So it makes the awareness recognition important from the beginning, but not at the expense of the buried emotions. Not just as a way to stay safe from what you don't want to feel. And so the awareness recognition and practice comes in with the repression work here, so that you can start seeing how you create your suffering and make that conditioning conscious. And that's what ends suffering. And as you end suffering, you'll notice you don't have to fixate on awareness. So because the fixation on awareness comes from managing the need to manage safety because of the buried emotions. So as you make those emotions conscious and your suffering starts to go away, you don't need to focus on what you already are, because you're stabilizing and coming into that recognition of what you are. Here's the thing about repression work here. It has to include an awareness recognition, because nothing else can hold all the parts of you. The ego, that what you think you are, cannot hold the buried stuff. The buried emotions created that ego for safety. So it's just a fiction that got created. I'm not good enough. I'm unlovable. But that's safer than what you've buried. See that? So that is safer than what you've buried. That's not what you are. That was created by what you buried. So that who you think you are will not be free here. The awareness, what you really are, is the only thing that can feel and allow those buried things. It's the only thing that can hold it all. So this is an awakening path, first and foremost, but it's really focused on embodiment and ending suffering. Not as a carrot, but as a seeing of how we create suffering in every moment to stay safe and get love. I hope this has helped. And, we're not feeling super eager to, I'm going to say this before I go. I didn't know this was going to come up. I'm not feeling super urgent around people rushing to awakening anymore at all. I think that is fear-based, even if a teacher focuses on it. I understand the suffering. I understand the wanting to not suffer. But when we rush to just recognize the presence, it just has to beg the question is, what are we running from? What are we rushing to? And I don't have the urgency to get people to rush to that, because I know it comes from what they don't want to feel. So if I can get them focused on making conscious the conditioning that creates that seeking and rushing, then they'll come into a more natural discovery of the awareness. Not as a coping mechanism or a trauma response to get away from what's buried, but as they're just recognizing that this is what they are. As they do this work, the work is done in that awareness. They're making conscious the very thing that creates their suffering in awareness. I hope this helps. If you want to get started, you can go to repressiontest.com. What that does is it just tells you what emotions you've buried, and then you'll be automatically added to our newsletter. I'm also going to put, if I can, some links to just get started with the work if you're ready in the description of this episode. Thank you for listening.